Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 hours before everything changed. Rachel Torres moves through St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego like a shadow during her first week, her hand steady on 4 lines, her voice quiet during shift reports. The fluorescent lights catch the faint scars on her forearms when she reaches for charts, thin white lines that crisscross the inside of her wrists like a map of a war nobody else can read. She keeps a tarnished military challenge coin in her scrubs pocket, touching it during breaks like a rosary bead, the metal worn smooth from 18 years of being held in a closed fist. The coin is the only physical proof she exists. The only proof she was ever anyone other than Rachel, the temp nurse. Nobody at St. Michael's knows that proof is all she has. The ICU exhales the smell of antiseptic and machines, that particular hospital odor that lives in your clothes and hair by the end of a 12-hour shift, a mixture of bleach and human systems failing. Rachel pauses at the chart of General Marcus Reed in room 407, a paralyzed Special Forces veteran with 2 months at the facility and a treatment plan that makes no medical sense. His billing codes don't match his condition. His medication protocols look designed to manage symptoms forever, not heal them. His physical therapy schedule is minimal. She reads the chart twice, her fingers tracing the numbers, and something cold settles in her chest because she recognizes the pattern, a patient being kept expensive and immobile, not through negligence, but through careful, deliberate architecture. She knows this because she has seen it before. She has also seen the man in room 407. General Marcus Reed. That name sits in her memory like a scar tissue, connected to a classification level so high the Pentagon burned the entire operation from every database. Bagram. 214 meters under enemy fire. His femoral artery severed by a steel beam when the compound collapsed. Her hands working on him in the rubble, applying a tourniquet while rounds punched through the concrete around them, her own spine cracking under the weight of carrying him out. The classified extraction. The erased records. The orders that followed, the ones that told her to disappear into civilian life and never surface in her real identity again, or federal charges would follow. Those orders are 17 years old and still binding. Rachel closes the chart and walks toward the nurse's station, her pace controlled, her limp barely visible if you weren't trained to notice it. The broken vertebrae never healed properly after Bagram. The DoD wouldn't authorize surgery for someone who officially didn't exist. She had healed herself through physical discipline and the kind of pain management that doesn't involve speaking to anyone about how deep the damage goes. Dr. Caldwell is watching her from his desk when she arrives, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he taps his pen against the counter. The watch costs more than her monthly rent. So does his suit, a tailored charcoal that probably came from somewhere in Beverly Hills, the kind of garment that announces a man's net worth before he opens his mouth. He has the face of someone who has never been denied anything, pale eyes with the flat effect of a predator studying prey. His name tag reads Dr. Sterling Caldwell, MD, cardiology, as if the credentials matter to anyone who already sees him. He had no idea the temp nurse walking past his desk had carried General Marcus Reed out of a collapsed building while the world burned around them. He had no idea the woman he was about to humiliate was a Master Chief Petty Officer, 17 years buried in the classified section of DoD archives, her existence systematically erased from every military database on the planet. What he did know was that she was asking the wrong questions about the wrong chart. "You're the temp," Caldwell says, his voice like an engine revving just below his vocal cords. Rachel stops and turns. His eyes move over her with the quick assessment of a man calculating how easy she would be to destroy. "Torres, right? How long are you here for?" 2 weeks, Rachel says. The training kicks in automatically. Keep it short, don't volunteer information, let the silence do the work. She has 17 years of practice at disappearing inside rooms full of people. 2 weeks. He smiles. It's not a smile that reaches his eyes. "You'll quit before then." Rachel doesn't respond. Responding would be engagement. Engagement would be memorable. She needs to be forgettable. She needs to be invisible. She needs to be nobody. "I'm serious," Caldwell continues, leaning back in his chair. "I'll bet you $100 you don't make it to day 10. Maybe you'll realize nursing isn't for you. Maybe you'll get a better offer. Maybe you'll just remember that temp work is for people without long-term prospects. He pauses, letting that last part settle. Around them, the nurse's station continues its quiet chaos, phones ringing, printers humming, the gentle electronic beeping of monitors in the distance. Nobody is paying attention to them specifically, but everyone is aware of the interaction. That's how these things work in hospitals. The pecking order gets established through public displays of dominance. "I'll be here," Rachel says. "We'll see." Caldwell doesn't look away as she turns and walks back toward the supply room to restock medication carts. She can feel his attention tracking her, the way predators track movement. She doesn't know yet that he has already made inquiries about her background, that he has already confirmed her references are impeccable but suspiciously recent, that he has already decided she represents a problem. What he discovered in those inquiries was that Rachel Torres appeared in the healthcare system approximately 4 months ago, with no prior work history, no verifiable education from any university he could contact, and certifications that checked out perfectly but somehow had nobody behind them willing to discuss her directly. She was like a person who had been inserted into civilian life with a completeness that should have been impossible. To Caldwell, who operated in networks of corruption and leverage, impossible simply meant something he hadn't figured out yet. The medication cart wheels squeak against the tile as she pushes it back toward the ICU, the sound like a small animal's distress call. Rachel's hands move through the routine of restocking with the muscle memory of someone who has done this exact motion 10,000 times, not in civilian hospitals, but in field hospitals, in medevac helicopters, in the kind of places where mistakes kill people and muscle memory keeps you alive. She doesn't think about it anymore. Her body just knows. General Marcus Reed is awake when she passes his room. Through the window, she can see him staring at the ceiling, his paralyzed body outlined under thin hospital blankets like a map of somewhere she used to know. His chart says he lost feeling from the mid-spine down. His chart says he has 6 months before the deterioration becomes irreversible. His chart also says he has been at St. Michael's for 2 months and has not improved even slightly, despite being one of the most fit, most determined human beings she has ever encountered. She doesn't stop. Looking would be recognition. Recognition would leave evidence. But her hand touches the challenge coin in her scrub's pocket, the metal warm from her body heat, the edges worn smooth from the countless times she has held it in exactly this way, as a reminder of who she actually is when everyone around her has decided who she should be. That night, sitting alone in her apartment in Hillcrest, a one-bedroom rental with furniture that came with it, Rachel holds the coin under the light of her reading lamp. The challenge coin is the size of a poker chip, bronze-colored, with a worn profile of a Special Operations Command insignia on one side and a bagram coordinates on the reverse. The lettering around the edge reads Serpent Squadron and a date, 2007. 17 years. More than half her life ago. Her phone sits on the kitchen counter, a burner model she replaces every 4 months, the kind that doesn't register to any name or social security number. She has a Pentagon direct line memorized, a number that connects to a classified secure system, but calling it would be a violation of the silence order. It would be admitting that she exists. It would be opening a door that the Dodd had very deliberately sealed shut. The silence order was absolute. No contact with previous unit members. No revelation of her prior service. No surface in any official capacity. Disappear or face federal prosecution for classified breach. Those were the terms. 17 years of following those terms exactly. She closes her hand around the coin, and the pressure of it against her palm grounds her the way nothing else can. Muscle memory. 17 years of disappearing into civilian life, and it still comes down to holding a piece of metal and remembering who she was before the world decided she needed to cease existing. The next morning, Rachel arrives at St. Michael's 20 minutes early, the same as she has every morning. The employee parking lot is mostly empty, just a few doctors' cars in the reserved spaces, German sedans and luxury SUVs that probably cost more than she will make in 5 years. She walks through the employee entrance, past the security desk where the guard barely glances up, and into the fluorescent-lit hallway that smells like institutional coffee and floor wax. The cafeteria is busy during her break, the lunch rush of day shift workers and visiting physicians creating the kind of organized chaos that hospitals seem to run on. Rachel carries her tray through the line, salad, grilled chicken, unsweetened iced tea, and scans for an empty table away from clusters of staff. What she doesn't notice is Caldwell watching her from across the room, his expensive suit somehow still crisp at noon, his lunch untouched on the table in front of him. He's waiting for her. The moment she turns away from the serving line, moving toward an empty table, Caldwell stands and directly intercepts her path. He doesn't move aggressively, just steps into her space with the confidence of someone who has never learned what consequences feel like. His smile is the same smile from yesterday, the one that contains no warmth, just the anticipation of someone about to prove a point. "I need to talk to you about billing codes," he says, his voice pitched just loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. "Actually, I need to talk to you about why you shouldn't be looking at billing codes." Rachel doesn't respond. Her jaw tightens, just slightly, the kind of physical tension that takes microseconds to control. Around them, the cafeteria noise doesn't change, but the acoustic landscape shifts in the way it does when people sense a disturbance in the normal order. "You're a temp," Caldwell continues. "Which means you don't have the clearance to examine specific patient financial records. It's against hospital policy. It's against privacy law. But mostly it's against common sense, because you're nobody here." He pauses, and his hand rises toward her tray. "Let me show you what I mean." His hand catches the edge of her tray with surgical precision. It's not quite an accident. It's the kind of movement that someone could argue was a clumsy collision, but Rachel has spent 17 years learning to read the micro-movements of violence. She knows exactly what he's about to do because she's seen it 1,000 times before, in barracks and in briefing rooms, in the small domination displays that men use to establish hierarchy. The tray goes down. Her salad scatters across the linoleum in a spray of greens and dressing. The grilled chicken slides across the floor like a small projectile. Her iced tea glass shatters with the specific sound of broken glassware, the ice cubes skittering across the tiles like tiny skates. The cafeteria goes very quiet. "Oh," Caldwell says, his eyes filled with the satisfaction of a man who has just successfully humiliated someone in front of witnesses. "That was clumsy of me. You better clean that up." Rachel's hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't accelerate. The training is so deep now that her body doesn't even register the insult as adrenaline. It processes it as information. Data. Pain is information. Humiliation is data. She bends down, reaching for the fragments of her lunch, and that's when Caldwell drops General Marcus Reed's chart directly onto the floor in front of her, the manila folder landing with a deliberate thud against the tile. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says, and his voice carries the specific tone of a man who is watching to see how far he can push before someone breaks. Rachel's jaw clenches. She can feel the muscle working at her temple, the precise physical manifestation of restraint. But her hands remain steady. Her breathing remains level. She reaches down, picks up the chart with the same controlled movement she used to retrieve her lunch, and stands up without making eye contact. Around her, nobody moves. Nobody speaks. The silence in the cafeteria has taken on weight, the kind of heavy quiet that follows moments of deliberate cruelty. Rachel walks away from Caldwell without responding, without acknowledging the satisfaction in his voice, without giving him the reaction he was hunting for. She disposes of the scattered lunch in the trash and walks back toward the ICU, the chart held against her scrubs, her limp not quite visible, her face showing nothing of the 17 years of survival that just passed through her body in the span of 10 seconds. What nobody in that cafeteria knows is that Rachel Torres has survived worse than humiliation. What they don't know is that she has held a man's femoral artery closed while concrete fell around them. What they cannot possibly understand is that being called sweetheart by a doctor in a cafeteria is the kind of small thing that the human nervous system learns to categorize as background noise after you have experienced real violence. What they also don't know is that the chart Dr. Caldwell just handed her belongs to the one man in San Diego who could identify her. The one man alive who knows exactly who she used to be. The one man whose blood she still dreams about, 17 years later, warm on her hands. The memo landed in every inbox at 7:43 that morning. Rachel didn't see it until her second shift, when a resident named Dr. Chen pulled her aside in the supply room, his voice low and careful. "You need to know what Caldwell just sent upstairs," Chen said, sliding his phone across the counter. Rachel read the words once, then again. Asterisk to all clinical staff, General Marcus Reed's case presents significant liability exposure. Any physician entering his room without explicit written authorization from myself or hospital administration will face disciplinary review, potential suspension, and legal responsibility for adverse outcomes. This is not a suggestion. This is a requirement. Dr. James Caldwell, Chief of Medicine. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head. Rachel's jaw tightened once, just a twitch at the hinge, but her hand stayed steady as she returned the phone. "Thank you for showing me," she said quietly. "He's freezing him out," Chen whispered. "Nobody's going in that room now. 20 doctors just got told not to. Reed's orders are locked down, his case is essentially frozen, and if he deteriorates..." Chen didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rachel returned to the ICU rounds with her vital signs sheet and her portable monitor, moving through the sterile corridors like water finding its level. She had trained for 17 years to move through hostile environments without leaving a trace. This hospital was just another kind of battlefield. Fluorescent instead of desert sun. Tile instead of sand. But the physics were the same: assess the terrain, identify the threats, survive without revealing what you actually are. General Marcus Reed lay in room 412, his broad shoulders framed by pillows, his legs covered by a thin thermal blanket from the Bear Hugger warming system that kept his core temperature stable. His eyes tracked her the moment she entered. Recognition flickered there, careful and controlled. She had pulled him from rubble in a place she was never supposed to acknowledge. She had felt the heat of his femoral bleed, had jammed her fingers into the wound while the building came apart around them, had wrapped a combat tourniquet she'd made from her own uniform and whispered, "Stay with me, sir. Stay with me." He had nodded, actually nodded, while concussions blew out windows behind them. 17 years later, he couldn't move his legs. "Vitals are stable," she said, running her eyes across his monitors without looking directly at his face. The heart monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm. Oxygen sat at 94%. Blood pressure 120/78. Everything measured and controlled and going absolutely nowhere. She adjusted the foredrip with precision, her movements economical, her presence a controlled breath in a room full of machines. Physical therapy request was submitted, she said quietly, just above a whisper. "It won't clear today." Reed's eyes closed for 2 seconds. When they opened, they held something that looked like gratitude and something that looked like resignation combined. She left without another word. The third shift was worse than the second. Rachel worked the ICU rotation alongside 12 other nurses, and she began to understand the architecture of Caldwell's strategy. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Rounds happened at 6 in the morning, and she watched as the attending physician, a Dr. Morrison with 30 years of experience, walked past Reed's room entirely, moving to the next patient without even glancing at his door. The chart sat at the nursing station gathering dust. Orders stayed frozen. Consultations requests dropped into a digital void and vanished. By afternoon, Rachel had counted 17 doctors who had deliberately avoided the ICU corridor. By evening, it was 20. Exactly 20. She noted their names, their departments, their refusal to make eye contact with anyone who worked near Reed's case. It wasn't panic. It was calculation. Caldwell had sent a message, and every single physician on staff had understood it. Revenue protection. Liability shields. Consulting fees. Don't touch the golden goose, even if it's dying. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee hung in the break room when Rachel finally sat down at 9:30 that evening. She had been on her feet for 9 hours. Her scrubs clung to her back, damp with sweat from the ICU's aggressive air filtration system. Other nurses rotated through, grabbing cold coffee and energy drinks, their conversations orbiting around a single gravitational center. Don't go near Reed. Don't ask questions. Don't let Caldwell hear you caring. Rachel sat in the corner with her own coffee, cold, bitter, forgotten for 2 hours, and pulled out her phone. The photographs she'd taken of Reed's chart were grainy but legible. Treatment timelines. Equipment billing schedules. A pattern of requests filed and then systematically denied. She scrolled through them once, committing the numbers to memory the way she had been trained, then deleted the photos one by one. Digital evidence could be traced. Memory couldn't. At 10:15 that evening, she made her way to the third-floor conference room. Through the frosted glass, she could see shadows moving. Caldwell's voice came through the heavy door, smooth and controlled. The equipment rental contracts run through the calendar year, he was saying. If Reed's condition stabilizes, if he actually shows neurological recovery, the monthly billing drops from $42,000 to approximately $8,000. That's a $340,000 quarterly swing. A woman's voice responded, older, professional, layered with financial precision. That assumes the patient would improve. Based on his admission diagnosis, the prognosis is poor regardless of intervention. The prognosis is whatever we document it to be, Caldwell said, and Rachel heard the smile in his voice. Which is why he doesn't get physical therapy. Which is why we don't bring in neurospecialists. Which is why the temp nurse asking questions about his treatment plan has become a liability I need to manage. Rachel's hand froze on the stair railing. Her breath stayed level, controlled, measured, filtered through the training that had kept her alive in places where panic meant death. She continued down the stairs without changing her pace, her footsteps echoing on the concrete in a rhythm that said nothing about what she had just heard. The next afternoon, Caldwell called her into his office. His desk was too large for the room, a territorial display of power carved from mahogany and burnished to a mirror shine. He sat behind it like a man who had learned how to occupy space the way other men learned how to breathe. Rachel, he said, and the casualness of her first name in his mouth felt like a weapon. Your performance reviews have been adequate. Your technical skills are sound. But I've decided to make a staffing adjustment. She stood motionless, her hands at her sides, her breathing unchanged. You're being reassigned, he continued, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man making a move on a chessboard. Effective tomorrow, you'll be working postpartum recovery. 4th floor. Much less complex than intensive care. Better suited to your skill set. I'd prefer to remain on the ICU rotation, Rachel said quietly. Each word came out separate and distinct, like bullets from a suppressed weapon. Caldwell laughed. Actually laughed. That's not a request I'm inclined to grant. General Reed's case is now classified as stable chronic. He doesn't need the level of care you've been providing. And frankly, your curiosity about his treatment plan has become disruptive. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled with practiced precision. You're a temp, Rachel. You're here because we needed bodies, not because we needed your particular brand of initiative. I'd hate for someone to look too closely at your references, your certification history. These things can get messy, you know? Inconsistencies. Gaps. It might be better for everyone if this was your last week. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Rachel's face remained a mask, no flush, no tremor, no betrayal of the 17 years of classified operations and buried records that Caldwell was unknowingly circling. She had disappeared into a civilian identity once already. She could do it again. When do I start on the 4th floor? She asked. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. The postpartum unit coordinator will expect you. He waved his hand dismissively, already reaching for his next file, already certain of his victory. Welcome to your new assignment, sweetheart. That evening, Rachel sat at her kitchen table with her 8-year-old son David Jr., watching him work through his multiplication tables while the San Diego traffic hummed outside their small house. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, a moment frozen from his 5th birthday, David Jr. with frosting on his nose and laughter in his eyes. Nothing on those walls suggested who she had been. Nothing suggested anything at all. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the challenge coin. Tarnished silver, the edges worn smooth from 17 years of being held, squeezed, gripped until her knuckles went white in supply closets and empty parking lots and the quiet spaces between who she was and who she had to pretend to be. The coin was heavy in her hand, warm from her pocket. Bagram operations. A code name that belonged to another life. A general's name that she could never acknowledge knowing. Mom. David Jr. looked up from his worksheet. You okay? I'm fine, baby, she said, and closed her hand around the coin. Just a long day. Just a long day. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the air conditioning unit cycle through its patterns. In room for 12 of St. Michael's Hospital, General Marcus Reed was probably staring at his own ceiling, his paralyzed legs beneath a thermal blanket, his case now officially frozen by a physician who didn't even know the woman sitting at his feet in Bagram had 3 Purple Hearts and a Navy Cross hidden in an attic 12 miles away. 20 doctors had refused to enter his room. 20 deliberate refusals. And she was being removed from the battlefield the moment she started asking the right questions. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that tomorrow morning, she would walk to the 4th floor and pretend to be someone she had never been, while the man whose life she had saved was left to deteriorate in a room no doctor would enter, in a hospital full of men who valued money more than the lives they had been trained to save. The 4th shift started like the others. Rachel clocked in at 7 in the morning, her scrub still carrying the faint smell of the postpartum wing, antiseptic and baby powder, a chemical reminder that she didn't belong there. The charge nurse handed her an assignment for rooms 412 through 417. All stable. All routine. All as far from the ICU as the hospital architecture allowed. But Rachel had never been good at staying away from dying people. She took her breaks on the 4th floor now, passing the ICU corridor on her way to the cafeteria that wasn't really the cafeteria, just a back stairwell where she could sit alone and watch the patient monitors through the observation window. The rhythms told stories if you knew how to read them. Sinus. Atrial fib. Bradycardia. Each one a sentence in a language only the trained could parse. And General Marcus Reed's rhythm was getting darker by the day. 2 days after her reassignment, Rachel flagged his chart. Irregular rhythms at 1:36 p.m. Early signs of cardiac distress. Recommendation: immediate cardiology consult. She submitted it through the digital system and watched the notification sail into Dr. Caldwell's inbox. 20 minutes later, a response appeared, reviewed. Monitoring continues. No physician had entered the room. No physical examination. Just a remote clearance from a man whose only interest in Reed was keeping him expensive and immobile. The next morning, the irregularities had worsened. Rachel flagged it again at 6:33 a.m. Dr. Caldwell reviewed this within 30 minutes. Current protocol sufficient for attending. She read it 3 times, understanding what it actually meant: no one is saving this man. The system had been weaponized. The hospital had become a machine designed to let people die at a profit. At 10:15 a.m., she found herself standing outside Caldwell's office. He was at his desk, reviewing something on his computer, probably insurance codes, probably bills, probably the quarterly numbers that made him smile the way most people smiled at their children. He didn't look up when she entered. General Reed needs a cardiology consult today, Rachel said. Her voice was level. Professional. Every inch the temporary nurse who knew her place. Caldwell's fingers continued moving across the keyboard. You're not on that case anymore, Rachel. We discussed this. He finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression like a man watching an insect crawl across his desk. Not anger. Contempt. This is your 2nd warning about overstepping boundaries. 1 more and I'll have grounds for termination. Am I being unclear? Rachel didn't answer. Answers required a kind of submission she had abandoned somewhere between Kandahar and a building that collapsed around two people who shouldn't have survived. She turned and walked out of his office the same way she'd walked into it, without hurrying, without flinching, without letting him see that inside her chest, something was fracturing. That afternoon, a voice came over the intercom at 2:51 p.m. ICU to all staff. Code blue, room for 21. Code blue, room for 21. The words moved through the hospital like electricity through copper wire. Voices changed. Shoes found faster rhythms. The machinery of crisis engaged. Room for 21 was General Marcus Reed. Rachel abandoned her postpartum assignment without signing out, without notifying anyone, without the kind of protocol that separates nurses who stay employed from nurses who walk out the door. She ran from the 4th floor down 3 flights of stairs, her legs moving with the muscle memory of 23 years, the kind of speed that comes from training your body for moments where every second costs lives. The ICU entrance was chaos held in careful formation. A crash cart blocked the door to room for 21, its drawers open like a surgical wound. Inside the room, Reed convulsed on the bed, his spine arching, his paralyzed legs trembling with the violence of a heart that had forgotten how to beat in rhythm. The heart monitor was a flat line, a horizontal screen that meant everything was stopping at once. Outside the room stood 3 residents, frozen in the posture of doctors who wanted to help but had been taught that helping could ruin them. Their hands hung at their sides like they belonged to someone else. "Where's the attending?" Rachel's voice carried the weight of command, though she was still pretending to be a temporary nurse in borrowed scrubs. One of the residents, a young woman, maybe 28, with the terrified expression of someone learning that medicine was politics dressed up in white coats, stammered the answer. "Caldwell sent a memo this morning. Hospital-wide. Reed's case has liability concerns. All physicians are instructed to document thoroughly and proceed with extreme caution. He said anyone who treats Reed without his explicit authorization could face disciplinary action or license review." The resident paused. Her eyes were red-rimmed. New tears or old ones, Rachel couldn't tell. "There are 20 doctors on staff right now," the resident continued quietly. 20 people who could walk into that room. 20 people Caldwell threatened this morning. And none of us will go in. The monitor flatlined entirely. The sound was nothing, a steady tone devoid of music, devoid of life, devoid of anything except the absence of electrical impulses that meant a heart had stopped. No bleeping. No rhythm. Just the hiss of the ventilator trying to breathe for a man who had survived a building collapse, survived a classified operation, survived a femoral artery wound that should have ended him in the rubble. And was now dying because 20 doctors had decided their careers mattered more than his life. Rachel looked at the crash cart blocking the doorway. Then she looked at the 3 residents. Then she looked through the window at General Reed seizing into stillness on the bed. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check the policy manual. She didn't wonder what the consequences would be. Muscle memory took over, not the muscle memory of nursing, but the deeper one, the kind that lives in bones that have made peace with dying. She moved the crash cart aside with one hand, the weight of it no obstacle at all. The door to room for 21 opened with the click of a latch that sounded like a rifle hammer cocking. Inside, the air was sterile and thick with panic. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a metronome for the dead. Reed's body had gone completely rigid, every muscle contracted into a final architecture of failure. His skin had taken on the color of old marble, expensive and cold. The 4 lines hung like the strings of a puppet someone had finally abandoned. Rachel didn't hesitate. She moved to the crash cart just outside the door and pulled a number 10 scalpel from the surgical tray. The blade caught the fluorescent overhead light and threw it back like an accusation. She felt the weight of it in her palm, familiar the way an old friend's handshake is familiar. She positioned it at the left midclavicular line, 4th intercostal space, the anatomical roadmap burned into her nervous system from training that predated her career as a nurse by nearly 2 decades. The blade went through skin and fascia and intercostal muscle in one smooth motion. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Just the kind of certainty that comes from having done the impossible before and knowing it was possible again. Blood welled up, dark and alive. The thoracic cavity opened like a door. Rachel's hand moved into the wound, her fingers finding the heart, that fist-sized engine of everything, collapsed and useless and suddenly warm and real in a way that made everything else disappear. No hospital policy. No Dr. Caldwell. No 20 doctors standing in hallways choosing their pensions over this man's life. Just her hand and his heart and 7 minutes on the clock that nobody had started but that was already running in her head like a countdown. 1. She compressed the ventricle against the spine. 2. Again. The heart was thin, deflated, a muscle that had given up. 3. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, moving at the rate of human CPR, 100 compressions per minute, the rhythm of survival, the mathematics of refusing to let someone die. 1 milligram epi, she said quietly, and one of the residents, the young woman with the red-rimmed eyes, had it drawn up and was pushing it into reeds for line without waiting for formal authorization. The drug went in. Epinephrine. The chemical resurrection. The desperate prayer in pharmaceutical form. 4. 5. 6. Rachel's hands moved and moved and moved. The heart stayed flat. The monitor above the bed remained a horizontal line. The numbers on the clock in her head kept climbing. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. The smell of blood and open viscera filled the room like a memory. Charge the paddles, she said. 200 joules. The defibrillator pads went on. The shock was a percussion that moved through Reed's body like thunder through a building. Nothing. The line remained flat. She kept compressing. 3 minutes. 4. The muscle in her forearm was starting to burn, not with fatigue but with the familiar fire of muscles working beyond what most people ever demanded of their bodies. Another epi-dose. Another shock at 300 joules. The resistance of this moment was different from other moments. She'd been trained by the best, taught by men whose names were classified and whose methods existed in the space between legal and necessary. She'd pulled people out of rubble. She'd kept hearts beating when they had no reason to beat. She'd carried a man twice her weight through 200 meters of enemy fire while her own vertebrae cracked like rifle shots against the weight of him. But this was different because she wasn't supposed to be able to do this. This wasn't in her contract. This wasn't in her job description. This was the moment where a temporary nurse stops pretending and becomes something else entirely. 5 minutes. Her hands compressed. The blood on her forearms was no longer someone else's, it was part of the work now, part of the language. She was speaking directly to this man's body, this man she had sworn to save in an operation that was supposed to have never happened in a building that was supposed to have killed them both. 6 minutes. The monitor beeped. One lonely rhythm. Then another. Then a third. The flat line became a wave. Small at first, then deeper. The heart was remembering what it meant to beat. The electrical impulses were returning like soldiers coming home from a war everyone had declared them dead in. Sinus rhythm, Rachel whispered. She withdrew her hand slowly, watching the heart continue its work now on its own. The oxygen saturation climbed. 78. 84. 90. Stable. She stepped back from the bed, breathing through her mouth, her scrub soaked with blood that nobody would be able to explain if they asked. One of the residents was already calling for the cardiac team. One was documenting the resuscitation. One was staring at Rachel like she had just performed a miracle, which technically she had, though miracles were really just the intersection of training and refusal and the kind of hands that had learned how to hold life together when it was actively falling apart. Rachel didn't wait for congratulations. She moved to the sink and washed her hands methodically, watching the blood spiral down the drain. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song. The ventilator breathed its mechanical rhythm. Outside the room, the hallway was silent in a way that suggested people were listening to something they didn't have words for. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what would happen in the next 48 hours, when Dr. Caldwell discovered that she had violated a direct order, crossed a boundary that had been marked with threat and consequence, and saved the life of the one man whose expensive, prolonged suffering was funding a quarterly bonus. The worst part was knowing that her hands, which had just brought someone back from death, were about to sign the termination paperwork that would send her back out into the world where nobody would ever know what she had done. Dr. Caldwell's phone was already in his hand before Rachel stepped out of the trauma bay. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone who had made these calls 100 times before, board members who owed him favors, hospital administrators who understood that his quarterly bonuses were tied to their cooperation, a network of professional courtesy that had calcified into something closer to collusion. He stood in the hallway, voice steady, the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty that the system would bend to his will. "Get me Sterling," he said into the phone. "Tell him it's Caldwell. Tell him we have a credentialing issue that needs immediate attention." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the outside investigator had already found what Caldwell had carefully arranged for her to find. Inconsistencies in Rachel's work history. A reference number that didn't connect to anyone. A gap in her employment records from 14 years ago that Caldwell had spent months planting into civilian databases, breadcrumbs that would lead exactly nowhere. The investigator was thorough, professional, and utterly convinced that she was uncovering negligence rather than orchestrated sabotage. Rachel's fake references collapsed like a house built on sand. One number was disconnected. The other belonged to a clinic in Portland that had no record of her ever working there, because she hadn't. Caldwell had constructed an elaborate fiction around her civilian identity, a paper trail designed to look authentic until examined too closely. The investigator found what he wanted her to find, a nurse with credentials that didn't quite add up, employment history that didn't quite match, a person who appeared to exist but couldn't be verified. The security chief, a large man with kind eyes who clearly took no pleasure in what he'd been ordered to do, arrived at the trauma bay at 2:41 p.m. with Rachel's belongings already packed into a cardboard box. He didn't meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said. "We need to process your exit paperwork. You'll need to come with me." The walk to the front desk felt like moving through water. Everything was solid and real until the moment she tried to touch it. Her badge was cut in half at the counter with the kind of finality that sounded like a gunshot. The cardboard box held her scrubs, a coffee mug with a hospital logo, the stethoscope she'd bought with her own money. Her hands had started to shake somewhere between the trauma bay and the front door, not from fear, but from the collision of two identities suddenly crashing into each other. The professional mask she'd worn for 4 days was cracking. The parking lot was empty except for her 2009 Honda Accord and 3 medical transport vehicles lined up like sentries. She sat in the driver's seat for 23 minutes before turning the key, hands at 10 and 2, breathing like someone who had just surfaced from deep water. The afternoon sun was hot through the windshield. Outside the hospital, the world kept moving. Inside her car, everything had stopped. She drove home in silence. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of the engine and the sound of her own breathing, which had become something she had to concentrate on. The drive took 18 minutes. It should have taken longer. She was driving like someone on autopilot, muscle memory getting her to the small house on Maple Street that she shared with David Jr., the cover story made flesh, the life she'd constructed to hide the person she actually was. David Jr. was still at school when she got home. She had maybe an hour before his bus arrived. She sat at the kitchen table in the small house and let herself fall apart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do in 14 years. Not because she was ashamed. Not because she was afraid. But because the one thread that connected her to General Reed, the one thread that made it possible for her to honor the oath she'd sworn in blood and silence, had just been severed by a man who saw him as nothing more than a quarterly bonus. The tarnished challenge coin sat in her hand like a stone. Caldwell had thrown it on the desk beside her termination paperwork, the one physical proof she'd kept despite orders, the only evidence that Serpent 6 had ever existed. The coin bore the insignia of JSOC Task Force 121, the unit that had been erased from every database after Bagram. On one side, coordinates in micro-etched type. On the other, a single word in Cyrillic that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. When David Jr. came through the door at 4:32 p.m., backpack slung over one shoulder, he found his mother at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face. The challenge coin was clenched in her fist so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Mom? Mom, why are you home? What happened?" Rachel couldn't answer. How do you tell your son that you just saved the life of his father's commanding officer? How do you explain that the reason you can't tell him is because the entire operation was classified and buried, and you were ordered to disappear before it could ever be confirmed? How do you say that the man whose chest you just opened, whose heart you just held in your hands, is the only person on earth who could verify that you're anything more than a temp nurse making minimum wage? She held the coin and cried while David Jr. stood frozen in the doorway, confused and frightened, watching his mother shatter in a way he'd never seen before. The silence in the kitchen was so thick you could feel the weight of it pressing down on both of them. "I can't explain," she finally whispered. "I love you. I can't explain." David Jr. set his backpack on the counter and sat down beside her. He didn't ask any more questions. At 14, he'd learned that his mother carried secrets the way other people carried car keys. He'd learned not to ask. He'd learned that some silences were deeper than words could reach. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that the one person who could save her career, who could verify her identity, who could speak her name and rank without triggering a federal investigation, that person was still in a hospital bed 3 miles away, and she could never let him know that she'd just been fired for saving his life. The oath of silence that had protected her for 14 years had just become her prison. Honor and safety had finally collided, and there was no way through that didn't involve breaking one to save the other. She held the coin through the evening as David Jr. did his homework at the kitchen table, as the sun set over San Diego, as the shadows grew longer and the house grew darker. The coin was cold in her palm. The weight of it never changed, but somehow it felt heavier every hour. Rachel Torres sat in that kitchen at midnight, unable to sleep, unable to move, unable to do anything but hold the only proof that Serpent 6 had ever existed, and wait for a tomorrow that felt impossible to reach. The morning came grey and reluctant, as if the city itself knew what was about to unfold. David Jr. walked through the St. Michael's front entrance at 7:14 a.m., his school backpack slung across his shoulders, carrying something far more valuable than textbooks. In his hands was a showbox, the kind that holds sneakers or old memories, in this case, both. His jaw was set the way Rachel's jaw set when she was preparing for something that mattered. He'd inherited that from her. The security desk was staffed by Marcus Chen, a former Army Ranger who'd taken a desk job after a roadside IED left him with a permanent limp and a permanent sense that the world needed people who understood both worlds, military and civilian. He looked up from his phone as the kid approached. "Help you, son?" Marcus asked, already reading something in the boy's posture that made him sit straighter. David Jr.'s voice cracked on the first word. "Mom, they need to see these." He didn't say his mother's name. He just said it like a statement of fact, like his mother was singular in the universe. Then he upended the showbox. Medals fell across the polished granite counter like rain on still water. The sound was impossible to ignore, the hard metallic clink of military honors landing in the middle of a hospital lobby. A bronze star caught the fluorescent light and threw it back. A purple heart. Then another. A Master Chief insignia pin, tarnished but unmistakable, identical to the one Rachel had pressed into her pocket 16 years ago in Bagram. Marcus went very still. He picked up the insignia with 2 fingers, the way you might pick up something radioactive. His hand trembled, not from age, not from injury, but from recognition. The pin bore 3 chevrons and a trident. It bore the weight of a rank that didn't work temp shifts in San Diego hospitals. It bore the weight of a name. Serpent 6, Marcus whispered to the insignia. The words hung there. David Jr. didn't know what they meant, but he knew they meant something enormous, because Marcus's eyes had gone the color of someone looking at a ghost who'd learned to walk again. Marcus picked up the hospital phone with his free hand. His movements were deliberate, precise, the movements of a man who'd made calls that changed people's lives. Conference room. Board members. Now. He replaced the receiver and looked at David Jr. directly. Your mother's name. Full rank and rate. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, David Jr. said quietly. Marcus repeated it into the phone as he called upstairs. The words traveled through the hospital spine like electricity. By the time the board members assembled in the conference room 17 minutes later, they already knew something seismic had shifted. What they didn't know was how to measure it. General Marcus Reed wheeled himself to the administrative floor at 7:58 a.m. Nobody told him to go. Nobody had to. He'd heard the commotion, understood the magnitude in the way soldiers understand threat and support. He just knew. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair with the precision of someone who'd learned to move his entire body through sheer force of will. The board chairman stood when Reed entered. Everyone stood. The classified file lay on the table, the real one, the one that should have been incinerated 6 months ago, the one someone had quietly preserved as insurance against the thing that was about to happen. General Reed lifted the file with both hands. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority and something deeper, the weight of gratitude that had been locked behind official seals for 16 years. Master Chief Torres was assigned to Bagram Airfield, Loga Province, 2008. Her unit was designated Task Force Serpent. On March 14, a support structure collapsed during combat operations. I was pinned under structural rubble, femoral artery severed. His voice remained steady, but it cracked on the numbers. Blood loss at that rate means unconsciousness in 4 minutes. Death in 6. He read from the file. Master Chief Torres cut her way through an estimated 200 meters of active fire zone, carrying a 70-kilogram soldier on her back while applying direct tourniquet compression to a catastrophic arterial bleed. Sustained 2 cracked vertebrae from the structural weight. Did not request extraction until the general was stable. His hands lowered. She saved my life that day. She should have been the most decorated nurse in this hospital. Instead, the Defense Department classified the entire operation and erased her identity as a condition of her survival. The room held its breath. And then, General Reed said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more terrible, she saved my life again in this hospital, while 20 of your physicians refused to enter my room because one man's financial interests outweighed my life. He read further. Direct cardiac massage performed through emergency thoracotomy incision. Manual cardiac output maintained for 7 minutes until spontaneous sinus rhythm returned. The attending physician on record threatened disciplinary action against any doctor who attempted treatment. Reed's eyes moved across the board. That attending was Dr. Caldwell. And his reason, according to the internal memo, was liability concerns. The chairman's face had gone the color of old documents. General Reed continued, his voice like a man reading a sentence. The real reason, patient recovery would have eliminated the phantom billing Caldwell was conducting through a private equipment supplier. $42,000 monthly charges for $18,000 in actual equipment usage. Monthly advisory fees to Caldwell of $6,000. An arrangement worth approximately $216,000 over the 18 months of my hospitalization here. The room went so quiet you could hear the building's ancient pipes settle in the walls. Dr. Caldwell attempted to destroy her career to protect his fraud, Reed said. He failed. Because you don't break someone who's already survived having her entire identity erased by her country. You don't scare someone who carried a general through Bagram. He placed the file on the table. You cannot touch Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. That was when the door opened. Rachel stood in the frame like something that had finally stopped running. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a hospital logo sweatshirt, but her posture had shifted. The mask had fallen somewhere in the night, in the kitchen, when she was holding that challenge coin. What stood in the doorway was no longer a temp nurse. Serpent 6 had come home. Dr. Caldwell stood from his chair at the far end of the table. For one moment, he tried to move toward the door. Then he saw Rachel's eyes, and he froze. The eyes of someone who'd learned to make life and death decisions at 22 years old. The eyes of someone who'd walked out of a building that was killing her and asked only if the person on her back was breathing. "This is a mistake," Caldwell said. His voice came out thin. "I was protecting the hospital. Her credentials were unverifiable. I was following protocol. I was." "You were committing fraud," the board chairman said quietly. "And when a master chief noticed, you tried to destroy her." The hospital's investigator, the one Caldwell had hired to expose Rachel Torres' civilian history, had instead discovered his own reckoning. After the cardiac massage incident had expanded the investigator's scope, he'd looked at the billing codes Rachel had originally questioned. He'd found discrepancies that led to a supplier company. He'd followed the money to Caldwell's personal accounts. The investigation Caldwell had launched to destroy her had destroyed him instead. Within 2 hours, Caldwell's hospital privileges were suspended. Within 12 hours, the state medical board was notified. Within 6 months, he was teaching CPR certifications at a community college in El Cajon for $24 an hour, his name removed from every journal he'd published in, his reputation scattered like those medals across a granite counter, irretrievable. But that wasn't the ending of this story. 6 months after the morning David Jr. brought the show barks, Rachel stood in St. Michael's new Veterans Recovery Center wearing the insignia again, Master Chief Petty Officer, now in a position that mattered in ways that transcended rank. The hospital had created the program around her, funded by a grant that materialized after the Reed case made national news. 20 doctors had abandoned a paralyzed general. 1 nurse had saved his life. The calculation was clear. General Marcus Reed gripped the parallel bars that morning at 10:17 a.m. His legs trembled like a newborn colt's legs, like the body remembers how to work before the mind believes it. Rachel's hands hovered near his waist, close enough to catch him, far enough to let him exist as his own weight. "One more step," she said quietly. Her voice had changed completely now. The deference was gone. What remained was what had always been underneath, the voice of someone who made decisions in the dark and lived with them in the light. Reed's right foot moved 6 inches forward. His left foot followed. 4 steps total. His first unassisted step since the building fell on him in Bagram. When the tears came, they came in silence. The only sound in the room was the soft squeak of shoe soles on the physical therapy floor and the distant hum of the hospital's machinery, the sound of a place that had learned something about the cost of looking away. In the lobby, visible through the therapy room's observation window, sat Rachel's tarnished challenge coin in a polished glass case. The plaque beneath read, "Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. When 20 said no, 1 said yes." David Jr. stood in the corner of the therapy room, watching his mother guide a paralyzed general toward steps he'd been told he'd never walk again. He was finally understanding who she was. Not the quiet temp nurse who absorbed humiliation in silence. Not the single mother who worked double shifts to afford his braces. But the woman who'd learned, 16 years ago, that power wasn't a title you wore. Power was the ability to help, and the willingness to help even when it cost everything. When Reed was back in his wheelchair, he reached for Rachel's hand. His grip was stronger now than it had been 6 months ago. Not because her medical work was miraculous, though it was. But because he was finally believing that a body that had been broken could work again. That hope wasn't naive. That sometimes the person standing next to you in the hospital corridor is someone who carried a general through Bagram fire and never mentioned it once. "Why?" he asked her quietly. "You knew it would destroy you. You knew Caldwell would come after you. Why save me that first time, and then again here? Why sacrifice everything?" Rachel looked at the challenge coin in the lobby, its surface finally polished, its history finally witnessed. She looked at her son. She looked at a general learning to walk again because one nurse had refused to accept that 20 doctors saying no meant the answer was no. "Power is not a title, sir," she said quietly. "Power is the ability to help. And I've never needed permission to do that." The words hung there in the space between them, simple words, the kind that change everything because they articulate what true strength actually means. If you've ever worked in healthcare, military service, or any profession where someone sacrificed their own safety for yours, I want to hear about it. Comment below and tell me about your own Master Chief Torres, the person who said yes when 20 others said no. Nominate your hero for hospital recognition. Like this video, subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, and tell me, would you have made the same choice Rachel made, even knowing the cost?